To order. This section of the Committee of Supply will now resume consideration of the estimates of education. As previously agreed, questioning for this department will proceed in a global manner. The floor is now open for questions. Mr. Altamir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this opportunity once again to be here in estimates. I want to thank the Minister for his attention to these matters, and I greatly appreciate the information that has come forward since the last time we were in estimates. And I'd like to begin with the Minister. I just want to thank the Minister for the first answer to my question today in question period. And I'd like to ask and begin, Mr. Chair, when can parents expect an announcement this week regarding schools for next week, Mr. Minister?
Minister Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, committee. Nice to be back in the estimates process. To the members' question, I expect we will be making that announcement on Thursday. Hopefully that will give parents, teachers, and all educators, school boards, a chance to make any necessary adjustments that may be required come Monday. Clearly, we're somewhat positive today in terms of our global case numbers relative to COVID here in Manitoba. That's obviously a positive sign. I hope that is a trend, but certainly beyond my pay grade to provide that sort of detail. That's why we will be consulting with our public health officials and over the next day or two, and obviously have those discussions and advise Manitobans where we're going to go. And just say we do have the school this school order in line with public health orders more broadly. So clearly, government will have a discussion with public health over what the broad public health orders look like going forward as well. So we certainly want to be in step with what the the general public health orders look like when it comes to schools. I don't think our strategy has really not changed. Our goal has always been to keep students in the classroom when it's safe to do so, and optimistic we can get to some sort of hopefully normal here over the course of the next month, so that students do have the opportunity to get together again in the classroom, COVID safely, of course. But I think most students would like to get into the classroom prior to the end of the year. So recognizing, of course, graduation is coming up for a number of students, and what that looks like, I think a little early to tell yet. I think probably parents and educators are looking at various options. I know we went through that last June as well. So we'll be having further discussions with our public health officials on what potentially graduation looks like for 2021.
Mr. Altamir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Last time we were in estimates, I asked the Minister to provide a detailed breakdown of the $40 million that he's been quoted as saying that we will save and will be reallocated with the elimination of school boards. Will he commit to providing a detailed breakdown of how the department came up with the $40 million number?
Minister Cullen.
Yes, thanks. I do remember the conversation we had last week around this. I think last week we talked, we got into a bit of the specifics around school trustees and the $10 million that's currently required to facilitate school trustees, elections, and all those things around that. So obviously a big portion of that would be reflected in that, the 40 million. I will say, for the sake of today, obviously we're looking at a shared services model where we can reduce costs on that basis. Another category would be sort of on the, I'll call it the administrative side. So kind of the unification of regions so that we're not duplicating things 37 times over. So those are the three broad categories. We are working with school divisions currently in terms of our transformation roadmap. I think, as we discussed, we are planning to put our transformation roadmap, make that public this fall. So as part of that roadmap, we'll provide a greater detail around the $40 million in question.
Mr. Altamere. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to that detailed breakdown because a lot of people are wondering about how that $40 million number was derived from, because the work still needs to be done, and we're having a hard time understanding how the work of school administration will be rationalized. I guess it'll be very interesting to see. We do know that the federal government transferred $85.4 million in funding to support schools during the pandemic. We also know that, for example, the Alberta government provided a school-by-school and school division breakdown of exactly where that money was expended. Can we expect the same from the Department of Education?
Minister Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just reviewing some of the statistics and the numbers that we set aside for the COVID Safe Restart program. We did set aside a total of $185 million for that. And just to go back on our previous conversation, we estimated what school division costs would be for COVID early on in the pandemic, not necessarily realizing what the full extent of those particular costs might be. And that's still a work in progress, quite frankly. But we did set aside $76 million on the allocation per pupil to school boards and school divisions. So that was the set aside on the per pupil basis. We've also established approximately a $40 million, what we call a contingency fund. So school divisions can apply for extra COVID expenses out of that fund as well. So just to be clear, we are asking school divisions to submit their COVID expenses, both out of the $76 million pool and the $40 million contingency pool as well. So we're working our way through that process. I think at the end of April, we've allocated just over $122 million out of that 185. So that's where we're at as of the end of April. I will say specifically to the members' question about a school by school breakdown, I think it would be prudent if we did that sort of post school year. So post June 30th would be an opportune time to see how the chips all fell out over the course of this year's school year in relation to COVID. So I think our department will undertake the school by school analysis on that and what monies had been allocated or in the process of being spent for this school year. Certainly, having said that, we have set aside, again, our fiscal year is different than the school year. So we have set aside money in this school year, this fiscal year as well to cover the end of last year's school year and also next fall going forward as well. So we're, as I said, we've allocated about $122 million out of the 185 to the end of April. I think we're somewhere in that 160 to 170 is what we anticipate being spent by the end of June in this school year. Again, that will be contingent upon the applications submitted by the respective school divisions.
Mr. Altamir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say to the minister that every other province just handed that federal money over to schools. They took that money, handed it over so that it could be used for this one-time allocation. Certainly schools and school divisions in Manitoba would have appreciated the same. It would have taken away this bit of a like, where is the money game that we're playing here? Just simply hand this one-time allotment over so that it can be used right away. Would have certainly taken the pressure off schools, especially when it came to remote learning and supporting kids that don't have the regular access to online learning or even the technology and just as simple as the laptops available to be able to do that. Hand it over to the school divisions who are really nimble and really able to provide the supports, boom, just right away. That would have been greatly appreciated instead of this game of having to identify costs and hand them into the department and then maybe you'll get your money. I will tell you, COVID demanded a little more than just justifying where funds are being spent. But I'd like to move on to another topic. There are many shared services agreements that we have with school divisions and with independent schools. For example, River East Transcona has a shared service agreement with King's School for applied arts programming, as does St. Aidan's School with Winnipeg School Division. Can the minister provide some details as to what that's going to look like once we get past July 2022?
Minister Cullen.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I do want to go back to the Safe Schools Restart Fund. I mean, I will say there is an accountability piece, certainly on our end. We are responsible for the federal money as well. We want to make sure that school boards are paying, investing that money in certainly in COVID-related expenses. And I think that's fair. I mean, we have an obligation for oversight, obligation for governance. and we take that role seriously. Certainly, we tried to flow the money as quickly as possible once there was submissions, and I think we've designed a system that everybody seems to appreciate. But we just have to be mindful that the COVID-related expenses are indeed COVID-related, and they're within reasonable parameters as well. So I think that's pretty important. In terms of the member's question regarding existing obligations, contracts, if you will, certainly the contracts will transfer to the new provincial education authority. We don't want to have any disruption in services because of any changes in these contracts. We want to move forward and make sure we have stability in the system. That's why we are working with school divisions, school boards, as we move through the transition phase. And that's exactly what our transformation folks are looking at, and we'll continue to look at those agreements and those contracts over the next several months.
Mr. Altamir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sure the minister is aware of the Whiteshell School District and the unique funding arrangement that the Atomic Energy of Canada provides to Whiteshell School District and the local government district. It's a unique financial arrangement, one that benefits the community and certainly benefits the students in the Whiteshell School District. My question to the minister is, at what stage are the negotiations between Whiteshell School District and the province regarding transition that will occur in July 2022?
Minister Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just will say from the outset, yes, we're well aware of that unique situation in the Whiteshell, respective of Pinawa. There has been some correspondence back and forth on that particular issue with the school board, and I believe with the municipality as well. Going back to my last answer, I will say that we are looking forward to having stability during this transition phase. Let's say there are provisions within Bill 64 that would allow contracts such as this to roll over. This one is certainly a little unique, but we're having discussions around the details of that particular agreement to make sure that no one is caught off guard with that. Obviously, the local government is involved, so we have municipal relations involved in those discussions as well. So, although unique, I think it's something that certainly can be managed, and recognizing that we're having those discussions now, so I'm hopefully optimistic that that can be resolved.
Mr. Altamir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Rolling over an agreement into Sunrise School Division with this particular Whiteshell School District will be certainly challenging because the master agreement doesn't have any type of exit clauses in it. And so what I want to ask the minister is, will the minister consider extending beyond July 2022 to ensure that the master agreement that will come forward will ensure that the residents of this school district won't be negatively impacted by amalgamating with Sunrise?
Minister Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the member's line of questioning here, and I know he's trying to create turmoil around any changes in public education, and this is obviously one avenue he's going down. I will assure the member that the sky is not going to fall. I know he and his party and other agencies are trying to create the panic in the streets that everything will completely fall apart and our children will never get quality education ever again in the history of the province. And I can reassure the member that nothing can be further from the truth. We have legislative provisions to take these agreements forward. We certainly recognize the uniqueness in that particular region of of this agreement. That's why we're working with the school board, the local municipality, and we'll be engaging the federal government on this one as well. I have tremendous faith in the leadership we have within education that we'll be able to work through these various provisions, these various agreements, the various contracts we have across our province. We've got gifted people that will make sure that these agreements come to fruition, and any changes that are made would be to the benefit of everyone. So I know the members trying to create panic in the streets, certainly in the Whiteshell area, but and we'll tell the residents of the area that we have their best interests at heart, and we will certainly are looking into this particular agreement and agreements.
Mr. Altemeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With all due respect to the minister, the Whiteshell School District has been trying to engage in dialogue with the department on this issue, I will say, since March 23rd is when I was CC'd on a letter. And so, you know, I do know that things do take time, but I will say this. We're not trying to cause panic in the streets. We're just trying to bring voice to the concerns of the people in the Whiteshell School District. They deserve an answer. They deserve a response from the department. This isn't something new. This is something they're genuinely concerned about. I take offense to that statement about causing panic in the streets. This is seeking clarification, nothing more. And I want to assure the minister that these particular residents in Manitoba need to have some clarity. And I would hope that the department provides that in a judicious time frame so that they can make plans. Winding down school divisions and school districts isn't something that can be done at a flip of a switch. The agreement here also impacts other services that they share with the local government district, public libraries, community spaces. These are all impacted by it. I just simply want to make the minister aware that this is an issue that requires timely response, nothing more. I'll move on to another frame of questioning. Teachers in Winnipeg School Division have a new agreement, and we know that it took time to finally get everybody into agreement, and we do see that sometimes with the number of school divisions that this can happen, and yes, indeed, it'd be great once we do move to provincial bargaining that we can just have one negotiation and do it on a fair and equal basis, but of course, we have that ability to pay thrown in that I want to say to the minister is very difficult to swallow. However, because of a number of funding challenges that Winnipeg School Division has had, $5 million shortfall this past year is just one example. How they're trying to struggle the balance between fair wages for educators and providing education for students. I want to ask the minister, does the province have a plan to increase funding for all school divisions so that teaching positions aren't lost when we transition to the new provincial authority?
Minister Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the member's previous question, I was able to get a letter here that the department had sent to the chair of the White Shell School District Board of Trustees just May 18th. And basically the letter outlines that we're aware of the existence of the agreement, understands its importance and implications to the LGD of Pinawa and residents, and recognize that there is other agreements involving school divisions and school districts. So that was sent last week, I guess. And the LGD of Pinawa was carbon on that letter as well. So discussions are underway to try to get that issue resolved. So in terms of the bargaining positions and the arbitration rulings over the last few months, that certainly encouraged that. I think that was Winnipeg School Division was the last one to sign on. So that is certainly positive to see. I did just for the members' interest have a look back over the last almost 20 years, I guess, in terms of school teacher settlements. And I did note there was 2 years where teachers, only 2 years where teachers received 0% increase. Those were 2 years back to back, 1995, 1996. I think that was under the direction of Premier Dewar at the time. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting piece of history. And glad to see that we're moving forward with agreements with the respective school divisions. I will say on the financing part of it, we've committed as a government to increase provincial share of funding by $1.6 billion over the next 4 years. So we're excited about that commitment to K-12 education. I will also say to teachers, and I'm reminding teachers and all educators that we're going to be redirecting $40 million of administration to the front line to assist teachers, whether that be hiring new teachers or education assistants, more clinicians for evaluations, more resources for students with learning disabilities or mental health issues. We certainly want to make sure that those resources are available to the front lines. I know school divisions over the last few months have, again, the sky is falling and we're going to have to lay off teachers. And I get the political motivation for saying that. At the same point in time, we don't hear the Winnipeg School Division talking about laying off any of their 19 plumbers or any of their 19 electricians. So I get their political motivation to try to scare their electorate into saying that we're going to have to lay off teachers when we're not necessarily sure that that is indeed reality. So I will just say we're committed to K-12 education. We're putting our money where our mouth is, and we look forward to getting all these agreements signed and getting teachers a contract that will move us ahead for the next few years.
Mr. Altamir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to begin by saying that back in 1995, 96, those were the Philman years. Last time I looked, Premier Philman was a progressive conservative. It certainly wasn't Gary Dewar as the premier at that time. I lived through those times, and yes, indeed, 0 and 0, and forced Fridays off, the Philman Fridays. So I just wanted to remind the minister that, yes, we do know the impacts of having a progressive conservative government on public education and on public school teachers. It was felt, and it still continues to be felt. Getting back to the proposed bill, because there are no transitional provisions in Bill 64 in regards to adult learning centers, specifically no guarantee that current divisional funding for these programs will continue, will adult learning centers remain in the sense, will agreements remain with adult learning centers to ensure they continue the good work once Bill 64 comes into place?
Minister Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As with our previous discussion, these are agreements in place that would transfer over to the Provincial Education Authority. There's provisions in Bill 64 to allow that to happen. We both, myself and the Minister of Advanced Education, have indicated that we're reconfirming our commitment to advanced learning here in Manitoba. And we certainly support that transition work here in the province. I know the advanced learning certainly fits in with the minister's direction. And it certainly fits in with our Better Education Starts Today strategy as well. The base funding for adult nursery is out of the Advanced Education Department, I think to the tune of somewhere in excess of $20 million. So we're certainly committed to that. These agreements will extend to the new Provincial Education Authority as per the provisions in Bill 64.
Mr. Altamare.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's been a long-standing moratorium on school closures. The current system requires elected trustees to take extensive consultation with the school community and make their case to the education minister before a school is closed. They also have to make their best efforts to ensure each student's one-way trip to school is no more than 1 hour. Bill 64 doesn't mention either one of these stipulations. Would the minister clarify that it would be entirely up to his appointees and the Provincial Education Authority to decide on school closures?
Minister Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just appreciate the opportunity to correct the record here on this one. Maybe go back to the concept of a moratorium, and I think people have a perception of what a moratorium means. But the reality is the provisions that were in the old legislation, the Public Schools Act, those provisions around school closures remain exactly in Bill 64. I can remember actually when the previous government brought those provisions in. And they brought those provisions in because school boards were closing schools around the province. And the previous government thought they wanted to have some more control and more say in terms of that process. So I can remember exactly when those provisions were brought into the legislation. And it was really to stop school boards from running around and closing schools. we've carried these provisions forward so that school boards would not unilaterally go and continue to close schools. So the provisions around community consultation remain in effect under Bill 64. Now, I know this is something that school boards have been out fear-mongering in their communities about, but the reality is it's been school boards who have been trying to close schools for years. And that's why the previous government brought this provision in to the Public Schools Act. And that's why this provision remains, so that communities are consulted in terms of any potential school closures. Bill 64 has never been about closing schools. It's about how we enhance K-12 education in Manitoba. And that's why we got into this discussion. That's why we continue to have dialogue about that. And that's really what it's about.
Mr. Altamere.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to clarify and to set the record straight, in the former moratorium, it was the minister that ultimately decided on closing schools. The minister that's an elected official. Will that decision now move to an unelected, politically appointed board?
Minister Cullen.
I want the member to know, thanks, Mr. Chair, but I do want the member to know that the criteria that was in previous legislation remains in effect. And the Provincial Education Authority, operating under the direction of the government and the minister, will take these discussions seriously. So these discussions, before there is any school closure, would have to engage in the community and have support of the community. So at the end of the day, the Provincial Education Authority is responsible to the government, is responsible to the minister. That's the nature of the Bill 64. So the provisions as previously written remain in place.
Mr. Altamere.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The minister spoke earlier about meaningful consultation regarding school closures. Can the minister review what some of these measures will look like? The meaningful consultation, sorry.
Minister Cullen.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is from the Bill 64 itself, provisions for school closure. One, the closure is the result of a consolidation of schools within the community or area served by the school. Provision 2, there is a consensus for the closure among the parents and the residents of the community or area served by the school. In provision 3, it is no longer feasible to keep the school open due to declining enrollment, and despite reasonable efforts having been made, the Provincial Education Authority has been unable to expand the use of the school building for appropriate community purposes. So then there's further provision 192(2). The authority board must establish a written policy respecting the process for a school closure and ensure that the policy is implemented. And subsection 192(3), the contents, the school closure policy must provide for A, the notification of parents and residents of the community or area served by the school that a school closure is being considered. B, the distribution to the public of information about the school closure. And C, a public consultation process for parents and residents of the community or area served by the school to provide input and comment on the proposed school closure. So process is outlined, a policy is established, and the contents of that policy are established in legislation, which clearly talks about a consultation process.
Mr. Altamir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask about the provision in Bill 64 around school community councils and their exclusive makeup of parents only. Where is the voice of other community members going to be heard or how can it be heard in this structure? When currently there's absolutely nothing in Bill 64 that includes the voice of other community members.
Minister Cullen.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the question. So yeah, Bill 64 does lay out the roles and responsibilities of the school community councils. It lays out or formalizes a structure, and it does spell out parents would be on the executive at the local school community council. It's obviously the executive that will engage with the principal of the school. They will also engage with the director of education for the region. But broader than that, the executive can also more broadly engage with the community. So there's nothing in the legislation that would deter the executive with engaging in a broader community discussion about school achievement and what the community would like to see in that school, or what the priorities of that particular school are. So although the legislation lays out that parents and caregivers can serve on the executive, the ability for them to engage in the community, there's no restrictions in the legislation to preclude that discussion from happening. And I think we would entertain a broader community engagement in that process. And I will just add as well, I mean, we have formulated a parental engagement task force. We have 3 ministers on that committee. We have 5 or 6 parents with diverse backgrounds on there. We have some principals, assistant superintendents on that committee. So they're engaging with leadership around the province and parent advisory councils and parents. They've started that work just in the last week. They'll be carrying that work out over the next month, and they will be reporting back to the minister on recommendations in terms of how the school community councils will be effective, what that community engagement could look like, and certainly the roles and responsibilities of the school community council as well. And I would suggest that hopefully there will be recommendations coming out of there, how these school community councils can be effective and what resources they would require to be effective. I will say in my discussions with educators around the province, different schools have used different techniques to engage parents. And certainly we look forward to hearing more of those ideas and how we can use some of those best practices to engage parents and caregivers and, quite frankly, the broader community in discussions about outcomes for their local school. And I think one thing we have heard in our discussions is each school has their own priorities. They have their own wants, they have their own needs. And I think the community is best to be part of that dialogue. And then that's why Bill 64 talks about the relationship and the dialogue with school leadership, be it principals, vice principals, and or directors of education as well. So we do look forward to hearing input from Manitobans on that front over the next couple of months.
Mr. Altamir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to say to the minister that it's my hope that somewhere, either in regulations or in best practices, that what he just described does indeed go on with school community councils and community members. Members that are not parents, that have a vested interest in in their community school. In my experience as a school administrator and teacher, that is simply this. If it's not in regulation, it's not likely to get done. And there's an important voice there that needs to ensure that it's heard. So I would hope that the minister would entertain some adjustment to how we engage the community. One of these things also leads to ultimately, especially when it comes to schools outside of Winnipeg, is, you know, travel times on school buses for kids. We do know that in Bill 64 that there is a removal of the restrictions of student travel time. Can the minister explain why that was removed, when we know that more than an hour is counterproductive to a student's academic achievement?
Minister Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to preface my comments by saying that my dad was a school bus driver for a number of years. So I know exactly what it's like to be first on the bus and last one off. every day. And it's not a good use of time for students to be traveling on school buses, quite frankly. So I think we all share the same sentiments that we don't want our students riding on buses any more than they have to. You know, I think we're all want to have as much face-to-face time with our students and educators as possible. It's very clear that's where students learn the best. We're in a different dynamic in some areas of the province, for sure, in terms of trying to provide education and a broader education, maybe a more comprehensive course load to some of those areas, some of these smaller school locations. And I'm quite familiar with a lot of them. And there certainly has been advances on the technology side to try to allow that to happen. Optimistic with the announcement that was made just a couple of weeks ago with memorandum of understanding with ExploreNet, the use of some of the Manitoba hydro infrastructure, and that we're going to see an increase in broadband and connectivity to rural and northern Manitoba. And I would suggest this could be a real game changer for education in rural and northern Manitoba. And I'm really optimistic to see this unfold over the next couple of years. So specifically in the Public Schools Act, as it reads now, I would say the legislation is quite aspirational, I think is probably the best word to describe it. So under the current Public Schools Act, extended travel times, 43.1 bracket 1, in transporting pupils as required by section 43, the school board must use its best efforts to ensure that a pupil's one-way travel time to his or her designated school is not longer than 1 hour. So I would say that is the aspirational provision that currently exists in the Public Schools Act. Under Bill 64, there's provisions for regulations. As the member alluded to before, maybe some of these things should be spelled out in regulation. So the transportation component, I think, will be spelled out in regulation. And that'll provide some pretty clear direction to those that are going to be responsible for our transportation of students. And I think it's would be, sometimes it's difficult to legislate common sense because you assume common sense will just naturally take place. I'm optimistic that those that are being responsible for making sure students get to school will do everything in their powers to keep our travel time as low as possible. But having said that, there is room for regulatory governance when it comes to transportation of our students. And that's certainly something that could be entertained in those particular provisions.
Mr. Altamir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There is a large body of research that is really quite conclusive when it comes to poverty and its impact on educational outcomes, that there is a very strong link there. Manitoba still has one of the highest child poverty rates, unfortunately, in Canada. Any decrease that we've seen here in Manitoba is largely attributed to increases in the federal child tax benefit. Does the minister have a plan to address child poverty through Bill 64?
Minister Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm glad the member raised this this particular issue. Certainly, poverty has been a issue that's been raised on a number of occasions. But we can't use poverty as an excuse not to try and tackle some of the challenges before us when it comes to education. When we came into government, obviously, very high rate, highest in the country rate of child poverty. I know there has been some improvements in the numbers. That's certainly a step in the right direction. We will be the first to admit that more work is needed. That's why we have formed a poverty reduction committee of cabinet. We are working across government to try to tackle the poverty issue here in Manitoba. It's not something that the Department of Education can tackle alone. It's not something that educators can tackle alone. It's not something that can be legislated away. We can't just go in there and mandate that poverty disappear. That is completely unrealistic. And I would hope that anybody that takes the time to read our strategy recognizes that we're in this for the long haul. This is a 5 to 10 year document to set education and head it in the right direction. And poverty is one of those big challenges that we have to undertake. Bill 64 pertains to a governance model. Again, that is only one pillar, one of the 4 pillars in our strategy. And I think people would be remiss if they thought we could legislate poverty away under Bill 64. That's just not the intent. We have proposed a task force on poverty and education as they relate. I think we can pull together some experts in the area in conjunction with what we're doing across government at our Poverty Reduction Committee of Cabinet and see what kind of steps we can take in terms of both supports outside of the education system and supports inside the education system. I know other provinces are faced with the same sort of challenges, and I'm hoping there's best practices that we can learn from. I do know school divisions, different schools have taken different approaches, targeted approaches in some cases, to try to deal with the poverty issue, the absentee issue, which sometimes goes hand in hand. And again, looking forward to getting some of those best practices so we can spread those best practices across the province and really do something about poverty. We can't use poverty as an excuse to tackle some of these challenges in education. The reality is education is a way out of poverty. And I think if we put it in that context, then we can start trying to address solutions. And that's really what we have to focus on, are solutions to this. How we can engage students and how we can engage parents in the education system. And I am the first to admit it's not going to be easy. But that's why we got into this K-12 review. That's why we put together a strategy to tackle some of these challenges. And I know it's easy to make excuses not to tackle these challenges, but Manitobans and students, quite frankly, deserve to have
The
a
minister's
conversation.
time has expired. Mr. Altamare.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad the minister is aware of what school divisions have done to mitigate the impact of poverty. There are a number of school divisions in the city that have eliminated student fees, have eliminated lunch program fees, have eliminated band fees, all as strategies to mitigate the impact of poverty and to ensure programs are available to everybody on an equal basis. And these are very important strategies and very important pieces. We do know that Seven Oaks School Division has done this and has been a leader in this area, in the removal of these fees that were really a hindrance to program access. My question to the minister is simply this. People in Northwest Winnipeg haven't been paying these fees. Will that continue after July 2022?
Minister Cullen.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the line of questioning from the member. I think the member is right. I mean, we have a lot of different communities and schools and school boards doing different things around the province, and obviously trying to do what's right for their respective schools, respective communities. That's why, and I'll go back to my earlier comments about school community councils and having that community engagement process there. Schools, so parents in the community know what is best for their local school. And they can provide advice to school leadership in terms of what priorities they have for their local school. And certainly excited about having that conversation carry forward. Looking forward to hearing the results of the Parental Engagement Task Force on that. And I'm expecting some of these issues will come to the front. And I know we've developed a system that's not equitable. Some areas are able to offer some of these enhanced programs. So we're trying to go to a system, obviously, where the provincial share of funding is higher, so that we can provide some of these programs that otherwise haven't been available in some of the areas of the province or some of the schools in the province. So obviously, lots of nuances from community to community and, in fact, school to school. But in looking at this thing in broad terms, I'm certainly looking forward to having that discussion about some of these best practices that are out there and how we can implement them in other areas of the province and certainly other schools around the province. So again, when it comes to poverty and some of these other issues, worthwhile having a broad discussion about it and how we can provide better outcomes for students. And at the end of the day, better outcomes for what parents want to have as well.
Mr. Altamare.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to, this will be a really, I don't want to use the word difficult. This will certainly be a challenge, Mr. Minister, that will need to be addressed. I certainly look forward to more dialogue regarding how this will be tackled. When I say this, I mean access to school programs equitably throughout the province. This is genuinely, I'll put my partisan hat aside for a second, this will be a challenge. One that I'm glad that we're willing to have some dialogue about, and I hope that we can continue to do that further, because it is all about the kids and having access to programs regardless of where a person lives, right? I think we all know that that's what the important piece here is. And in talking about programs and access to programming, we know that a lot of school divisions have invested heavily in an outstanding French immersion program. We all know of school divisions in the province that have done so. We've heard from a presenter during committee in Bill 45 how the demand for French immersion educators is greatly exceeding supply and availability. And I know that the minister alluded to a plan for hiring more French immersion teachers. I would like to know, is he able to provide an update on what these initiatives are and what the plan would be moving forward here as we get into a provincial education authority? Sorry about that.
I'll mute.
Minister Cullen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate this line of questioning. Certainly, we have seen an increase in the French immersion enrollment. We recognize that students and parents have an interest in that, and we're committed to French immersion programming here in Manitoba. We are working with our stakeholders to put together a recruitment and retention strategy in Manitoba. It's currently in development. So we're working with our stakeholders, including the University of St. Boniface and our school divisions. I will say did have a very positive discussion this past week with DFSM and their work on this front as well. And look forward to continuing the dialogue with them and others that are interested in providing a French language education. I will also say, I mean, certainly across government, we're interested in this. I know our Minister of Francophone Affairs is quite adamant that she would like to see additional resources and energy put into the recruitment and retention strategy around educators. Her and I had a conversation not too long ago with the federal minister responsible for this area. And I guess we were somewhat optimistic. This was prior to the federal budget, that there may have been a signal of more money coming for that from the federal government. I don't think we've seen any new money as a result of the federal budget. But having said that, we do have arrangements for some support with the federal government in terms of providing that French language education. So we'll continue to work with our federal counterparts on this front. Certainly work closely with our Francophone minister here and obviously all of our stakeholders around the province. And there's obviously growing interest, so we want to respond to that growing interest around French language education here in Manitoba.
Mr. Altamare.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll hand over questioning to the member from Tyndall Park, knowing that at 4:45 we need to begin resolutions.
Ms. Lamoureux.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I appreciate the member for Transcona handing over some time to me here. Just referring to page 21, on May 14th, I asked a question here in estimates referencing how the department currently handles situations regarding the importance of safety and respect, specifically when they're breached. The minister said you would get back to me with a more in-depth answer, and I was just wondering if you've had the opportunity to consult on this yet.
Minister Cullen.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the follow-up question. We have prepared quite an extensive response for the member. I'm not sure it's complete yet, but as soon as it is complete, I will send her over the written response.
Ms. Lamoureux.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. And okay, I look forward to the response. I'm just moving on to page 19 of the estimates book. And it reads that the modernization of the Education Act will support the objective to reduce red tape. So I'm wondering, what is the current red tape that exists in the K-12 education that the department hopes to reduce or eliminate? And just for the sake of time, with the hopes of cutting this red tape, could the minister please provide examples and explain how this objective will help Manitoba students?
Minister Cullen.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the question from the member. Let me try to be, with the time constraints, pretty broad in my response. I will say from the outset, we have 37 school divisions across the province. Obviously, they have their own organization. They have their own bylaws. They've created their own policies. They've created their own processes, internal processes. So we think there's a lot of duplication within the existing system now. We're looking at going to a shared services model where I think we can streamline a lot of that, whether that be on the administrative front, could be on the technology front as well. So we think there's opportunities there to remove some of the duplication that currently exists across 37 school divisions. But at the same time, we still want to provide some autonomy to the schools and some autonomy to the region as well. So it's not like a centralization of all of those services. We still need people in communities that will be responsible for delivering services and the administration at the local level. So it'll be certainly a bit of a balancing act to make sure that we do accommodate that. But I'm pretty confident we can find savings in terms of red tape reduction, as the member indicated.
Ms. Lamoureux?
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. And I guess I'm just curious about the process for this. Is it the minister's intention to meet with different schools, and what is the timeline on this over the course of the next year? And he talks about duplication. Are they going to be sort of categorizing, making an Excel spreadsheet, so to say, comparing what the schools are currently doing? Just what is the actual process? How do you go about reducing some of this red tape?
Minister Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will just advise the member that, quite frankly, our transition is underway. We're assembling a transition team as we speak to work through this transmission over the next couple of years. We intend to roll out a more detailed implementation plan by this fall. September, October is our time frame for that, so that should provide some more clarity around that. I will say that we have a consultant engaged right now who is working with school divisions in terms of what services they provide, their HR capacity, all of those sort of issues are being discussed with school boards across the province as we speak. So this will be ongoing engagement. I'm sure we will learn over the next few months. And I would say we're going to learn as we go down this transformation stage over the next several years as well. I think we're doing the same thing across government. We're learning as we go and trying to find ways to reduce red tape. And I think that's a challenge for government to make sure that they're staying fresh, looking at new ideas, and making sure they're delivering what the Manitoba taxpayers and Manitobans want in terms of providing services to them.
Are there any further questions? Hearing no further questions, we will now proceed to consideration of the resolutions. At this point, we will allow all virtual members to unmute their mics so that they can respond to the questions. I will now call Resolution 16.2. Be it resolved that there be granted to Her Majesty a sum not exceeding $37,831,000 for education, Student Achievement and Inclusion for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2022. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed. Resolution 16.3, be it resolved that there be granted to Her Majesty a sum not exceeding $18,220,000 for education, system performance, and accountability for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2022. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed. Resolution 16.4, be it resolved that there be granted to Her Majesty a sum not exceeding $1,541,773,000 for education support to schools for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2022. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed. Resolution 16.5, be it resolved that there be granted to Her Majesty a sum not exceeding $95,245,000 for education capital funding for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2022. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed. Resolution 16.7, be it resolved that there be granted to Her Majesty a sum not exceeding $260,385,000 for education, other reporting entities' capital investment for fiscal year ending March 31st, 2022. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed. The last item to be considered for the estimates is item 1A, the minister's salary, contained in resolution 16.1. The floor is now open for questions. Mr. Altemeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that line item 16.1, bracket A, be amended so that the Minister of Education's salary be reduced to $33,600.
Oh, that's generous.
It has been moved by the honorable member for Transcona that line item 16.1 subsection A be amended so that the Minister of Education's salary be reduced to $33,600. The motion is in order. Are there any questions or comments on the motion? Seeing none, is the committee ready for the question?
Question.
Shall the motion pass?
No.
Yay.
I hear a no. All those in favor, please say A.
Yay.
All those opposed, please say nay.
Nay.
In my opinion, the nays have it. So the motion is defeated on division. Okay, we will now go on to resolution 16.1. Be it resolved that there be granted to Her Majesty a sum not exceeding $2,469,000 for education, administration, and finance for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2022. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed. So this completes the estimates of the Department of Education, and I thank you all. Sure. Considering there are only 9 minutes left until 5 p.m., what is the will of the committee?
Committee rise.
Committee rise? All in favor? Committee rise. It's now 5 o'clock.